Right before King David died, he told his son Solomon to be strong, follow God's ways, and no matter what, not to worship other gods. Shortly after Solomon took over as king, God appeared to him and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Worried about following in his father's footsteps, Solomon asked God to give him wisdom, to know the difference between right and wrong. God not only promised to give Solomon wisdom, but great riches and honor as well. The first test of Solomon's wisdom happened when two prostitutes came to him. There was a young child that each of them claimed was theirs. Solomon knew one of them had to be lying, so he asked his servants to bring out a sword and suggested to the women that he cut the boy in two and give each of them half. One of the women was so worried that the boy would be killed that she immediately asked Solomon to give the child to the other woman. Solomon saw her love and protection and knew that it had to be her baby, so he gave the boy to her. The Israelites were in awe of Solomon's great wisdom. He ruled for many years, growing in wealth and fame. He also wrote down many wise sayings called Proverbs. During his reign, Solomon planned to finish building the temple his father, David, wanted to build. They built a temple that was not incredibly large, but was unbelievably beautiful and detailed. It was 90 feet by 30 feet and had 2 bronze pillars that led into the place where sacrifices were made. When it was finished, Solomon and the other leaders sacrificed a huge number of animals in worship to God. When they did, the whole temple filled with a thick cloud of smoke. Solomon prayed, asking God to meet the Israelites in the temple and hear their prayers. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from the sky and burned up the animal sacrifices. That night, God appeared to Solomon again and promised to bless him in all that he did, as long as he would keep following God. In some areas, Solomon did follow what God told him to, but in others, like worshiping other gods, he failed. Because of this, God told Solomon that the kingdom of Israel would be taken from his sons, and they would not enjoy the peaceful, successful reign that he had.
So today we want to continue on in our journey of the story. It's interesting as we move through the story, we are starting to hopefully see what we call some mega themes or meta themes of how we walk with God. What does faith look like? How God's upper story is always at work in the midst of our lower stories. And we start to see patterns that hopefully both inspire us, instruct us, but at the same time, I think at times convict us to say, gosh, nothing's really changed, has it? There's this, back and forth in our walk with God. There's this up and down. There's this obedience, disobedience. There's this, movement between faith and doubt. There's struggles and everything. It's constant, isn't it? This journey of faith with God. And so today we are going to look at Solomon, and one of the things that we try to do is, of course, you have this whole huge stories, these huge chapters that if you're reading through the story, and again, I always want to encourage you to sort of read the chapter in advance. You'll get more out of the message if you read the chapter in advance. But hey, it doesn't hurt at the same time. Read it afterwards too to reflect on it. So either way, you win. But today we want to look at Solomon. And as Brent and I were putting together the message, we were asking ourselves the question, like, what's that sort of key theme that Solomon's life teaches us? And we centered in actually on one of his proverb statements. Solomon wrote part of the wisdom writings, and he wrote these proverbs. And one of the proverbs he wrote was simply this. So let's just go to that verse in Proverbs 16:18. It's actually a great memory verse. So let's actually say it together. Pride goes before, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Let's say it again. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Now, I know you're all easy here because you got the screen, but actually, slide operator Dave, I want you to back up one. I want you to blank this screen out for it. We're going to now do it like in true memorization fashion. Okay, here we go. So let's say the verse again. Pride goes and before. Does anybody know where it's found? Proverbs, verse 18. 18. Let's see, we're right. Now, Dave, let's bring the slide up. Yes, here we go. 16, verse 18. I knew y'all knew it. Okay. Pride's a funny thing, isn't it? It comes in such a subtle way, and sometimes it comes in such an overt way. Unfortunately, what the proverb is saying here is that pride is often what contributes to the destruction of things in our life. Is so true. I'm going to date myself, but I can remember back in January of 1986, just months before I got hired by Allison Baptist Church, so I knew something exciting was going to happen that year. I was in my last term at Regent College in Vancouver doing my Master of Divinity, and I can still remember this beautiful day walking out, and it was an exciting day for a variety of reasons. It was the end of January, and I was coming to what was called my intercession studies, and they would do extra studies during the month of January before you start your spring session. And I was actually writing an exam that day, but what I was really looking forward to that day was after my exam, I was going to go watch something by NASA. There was a space shuttle launch that day. I was really pumped about it. And the reason I was pumped about it was because of all the space shuttle launches that were going on during that time, it was the first time a teacher, an average Joe person, was going to fly up. And I remember they had interviewed her on television and everything, and it was so exciting. And her classroom was going to watch, and all the students from all around America and Canada were watching this teacher blast off on space shuttle. And what was the name of the space shuttle? Okay, for those of you who are younger, you don't know this, but it was called the Challenger. And unfortunately, we know that 73 seconds after blastoff, one of the O-rings was compromised, which caused the fuel leak, which caused the space shuttle Challenger to explode into pieces in the air. And I still remember watching it. And it's one of those really freaky moments where you see destruction happen right in front of you. And you know what? I sort of said, wow, I don't know how they survived that. And you really can't believe that you watch people just die right in front of your eyes, right? And I was like, wow. Well, of course, everybody was shocked. I think, again, it was a reminder that our confidence in our technology ultimately is shifting ground, right? We all have this tremendous confidence that we're smart, we can do it. Well, it just blew up in our faces that day, right? It's a very shattering moment. The interesting thing is that, of course, studies came out, there was investigations and everything, and I was coming across actually a story by one of the engineers who actually helped design the O-ring. And apparently the night before, now there's always the story behind the story, right? And it always comes out way after the fact when everybody's speculating, what happened? Well, here now is the story behind the story. Alan McDonald, one of the engineers who helped design the O-ring on the space shuttle, was actually telling the NASA officials at the time, he said, listen, he says, we've never tested the O-ring when the temperature drops below this, like 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And that day when they were blasting off, it was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. It was quite cold down in Florida. And he was telling them on that conference call the night before, along with all the other engineers and all the people that were involved, he said, listen, he says, I don't know if we're compromising the O-ring because of the temperature. I mean, it was big engineering level talk. I mean, top level technology talk at the time. And of course, the NASA officials said, well, you're not in charge, we're talking to your boss, and the boss gave the clearance for it. And of course, as Alan McDonald reflects on why they wouldn't postpone the launch and wait until the temperature warmed up, he actually says this. He writes, he says, he claims that NASA fell prey to the oldest and most basic sin that we all struggle with, and it's called pride. McDonald said NASA had become too successful. They had gotten by for a quarter of a century and had never lost a single person going into space. Remember, they had rescued Apollo 13. If you don't remember that, just watch the movie. And remember, it blew up halfway to the moon, and they rescued that ship. Seemed like it was an impossible task, but they did it. So for them, this discussion about a cold O-ring, how it could possibly cause a problem when they had been so successful over all the years, well, they just said, McDonald goes on to say, they had a little bit of arrogance that you shouldn't have, and they just stumbled along into this disaster. And we think about pride, and pride can have disastrous results. Speaking of how pride, though, shows its head in so many different ways, I came across this interesting thing about this dating website. Some of you might want to write this down. Dating website. It's called OkCupid. And OkCupid actually revealed one of the survey questions that they found very fascinating, the response that they got, because apparently when you sign on to these dating websites, you have to fill out a profile, right? And what's your interest and da-da-da, and where do you feel you rate here and there and all that, right? Well, one of the questions that is asked by OkCupid is simply this, because they're measuring your compatibility with other people, and that question is asked, are you a genius? Are you a genius? Now, guys, this doesn't look good for us, but over 50% of the men that filled out this form, guess what they ticked off? Yeah, they ticked it off. Yeah, I'm a genius. Okay, you really smart men. For those of you who are into sports, we have to recognize that I think of an interview that actually Tiger Woods had, the great golfing sensation of the 1990s and early 2000s. And, of course, his infidelities and his very public destruction of his marriage, took place over the last few years, back in 2009. Of course, it's interesting in this interview that he just had in the last couple of days, he realizes now that his two children, Sam and Charlie, are now getting to the age of where they're going to go on the internet. And they're going to see all the stories about their dad. And, just by the way, in this new social media world, really, really play the movie about what you want to do with your life. Because now we talk about at the end of time, God opens up the book. Well, in a way, there's now a book already that you can get opened up about yourself, Because now Tiger Woods has to live with all this, and so he decided he had to sit down and talk to his children about his choices that were very public. And this is how, though, and it's interesting, though, again, how pride rears its ugly head, right? Because I couldn't help but still hear pride in Tiger's somewhat confession. Because this is what he said to his children. He says, this is what I tell my two children, Sam and Charlie. Hey, Daddy made some mistakes. But it's okay. We're all human. We all make mistakes. Wow. Okay. I guess that's one way you could describe all of that. As we think about pride, again, I just want to take you back to that memory verse. Pride goes before destruction, writes King Solomon, and a haughty spirit before the fall. As we think about King Solomon, these words came back, I believe, to bite him. The very words he wrote to help us live well, somewhere along the way, he also got infected with this spiritual virus called pride. Now, how do we see this? Well, again, let's just quickly do a trajectory of Solomon's life. And I really believe as we reflect on Solomon's life, it provides a warning of the destructive power of pride. Because so often what pride does is it destroys all the good that God is doing in our life. Now let's just begin with Solomon's life. I mean, Solomon, if we follow his trajectory, he was first of all born in privilege. He really was born in privilege. I mean, while his father David had grown up tending sheep and fighting bears and lions and probably living next to poverty and just subsistence living, now Solomon was growing up in a palace and being attended to by the palace servants and living a life of influence and prestige and status and power. And here was Solomon. I mean, it's interesting that even when Solomon was about to gain succession to the throne, it was, again, a very privileged place for him. You know, we think about royal succession today, let's say in England. It's done in a very orderly manner, but it wasn't so back in ancient Israel. Randy Frazee, who helped co-author the story, he points this out. As King David grew feeble with age, one of his sons, Adonijah, sees an opportunity to replace his father and makes his move. He calls some of his friends together, and essentially, this son of David declares himself king. But then Nathan, the one who had confronted David about his sin with Bathsheba, comes and lets David know what is going on. And you see, David had already decided that he wants his first surviving son he had with Bathsheba to be king, namely Solomon. And even though David is feeble, he isn't timid. He goes into crisis mode. He declares Solomon as his choice for king. He finds a priest to join Nathan to anoint Solomon. Then he plans a major celebration with trumpets blasting. And the people are shouting, "Long live King Solomon." And again, what a privilege that Solomon had to have David support him right into the succession of his throne. And as David passes the leadership baton to his son Solomon, Israel's in great shape. Financially, they're strong, they're prosperous, they're at peace. And if ever there was a good time to be king of Israel, this was it. Now, as I stop and just think about privilege, I also just think about us. And we are very privileged. We live in a peaceful land. We're not in Syria right now or Iraq. We're not in certain places in Africa or other places around the world where there's great poverty or injustice, inequity. We have so much given to us. And I think that sometimes if we're not careful with this privilege, we think privilege becomes a right rather than a gift. And rather than thinking about this privilege, saying, well, privilege for me right now is just so that I'm comfortable and the ones I love the most are all a nice little bubble of comfortableness. Rather than living that way, we should be saying, God, you've given me so much. What is it that you want me to do? What are the good works that you prepared in advance for me to do? So there was King Solomon's beginning point. It was from a point of privilege, but then it moves on to a place of passion for him. Because he really did have a passion to serve God. I always love this part of the story about Solomon. I mean, he had this divine encounter with God where God came to him early in his reign and tells him he can have anything he wants. Can you imagine what that would be like? God, who can provide anything, comes and says, whatever you want is yours. No boundaries, no rules. Ask for anything and I'll give it to you. Now, be honest. If you had this divine encounter with God himself, the God who created the universe says, what do you want? Ask of it. What would you ask for? You know? I mean, would you say, well, I'd like a golf course. Maybe that would be kind of cool. You know? My own cruise ship so I could take cruises during these harsh winter months. I mean, what would you say? Well, I mean, Solomon asked for wisdom. What is astonishing that his request is not so much for himself, but for insight to fulfill his duty as leaders of God's people. He essentially is telling God, you're giving me this awesome privilege of serving you. But I'm a mere child, and this nation is so huge, so please give me the wisdom to be a just and righteous king. I mean, well, so often, wisdom is that thing about knowing what's the next step to take in life. I mean, how often, right, do we really want to have wisdom about life, right? Not just facts, being smart about certain things, but real wisdom. And so that's what King Solomon asked for, and Solomon demonstrates this passion to serve God by asking for wisdom. We see the trajectory continuing really well. I mean, he's from privilege to passion, and now he's fulfilling the purposes God had intended for him. I mean, here we see, first of all, that he's serving his people with his wisdom. And again, there's that classic story you just saw about, the baby and the two women claiming to be the mother of the baby, and of course Solomon and his wisdom. And I always love these stories where just in the moment, you don't go say, I'm going to go think about it. Right in the moment, hey, give me a sword, I'm going to cut this baby in half. And of course the mother, who's the real mother, says, no, don't do it. And of course the mother who was faking to be a mother says, yeah, let's cut the baby in half, because I already lost my real baby, of course. And of course in that moment Solomon again proves his wisdom, and he serves his people to help people find their way through life well. Another purpose that Solomon fulfilled too was he shared his wisdom, as he wrote down hundreds of wise sayings that are included in the Bible called Proverbs. Let's not forget that a proverb, according to Solomon's own words, is for receiving instruction in prudent behavior. Can I tell you a great New Year's resolution is just read the book of Proverbs? Just make that part of your daily reading, or take a month and say, I'm going to read through the chapters of Proverbs. As he also fulfilled his purpose, he built the temple. If those of you have been following the story, remember David wanted to build a temple to worship God in and for the Ark of the Covenant to be placed in. And God said, no, David, it's not going to be you. It's going to be your son that builds the temple. And so, of course, Solomon builds the temple. Of course, David had raised all the money for it. And it took, apparently, one commentator says it took 180,000 workers 7 years to build this beautiful temple. And when the temple was finished, we read that God's very presence took up residence in the sacred section called the Most Holy Place. And at this moment, again, Solomon has this sense of God working in his life and what life is all about. He moved from privilege to passion to purpose, and he's saying, God, you're working out your purposes. Listen to part of his prayer as he dedicates the temple. He says, Lord, the God of Israel, there's no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants. Now listen, with your servants who continually, wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father, and with your mouth you've promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it as it is today. And again, Solomon is recognizing publicly and personally and before God and before the people of Israel how God is at work and he's fulfilling his purposes in the upper story. But then what happened? Something happened where Solomon, I really believe, didn't listen to the words of Proverbs 16:18. What is it? Pride comes, let's say it again, pride comes before, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16, verse 18. Why? How do we know something went wrong? Well, let me just first of all tell you maybe why I think he started to be filled with pride. Because as you continue to read the story of Solomon, you realize that not only was his wisdom recognized by his own people and his nation, but he started to be recognized from all the nations around him. And people like the Queen of Sheba came and gave him honor and glory for the wisdom. I mean, if they could tweet back then, he'd probably be, having 10 million followers, He'd be the most famous one on Facebook. He'd have the concert room halls packed out. He'd be the most talked about person in the world at the time. And so here we are, and now people are starting to come to him, and they're saying, oh, you're so smart, you're so smart. I always say it's a dangerous time when you're having people praise you all the time. It's dangerous, right? Success can be a very succulent, kind of savory thing that you just sort of want to, oh, yeah, I love that. That's great. Keeps feeding the soul. And then, of course, he got wealthy. He got really wealthy. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when you have a big stash of cash, you can kind of walk in and go, hey, I don't know about the rest of you poor slobs, but I got my act together. And there can be a bit of pride in that too. And we read actually, one commentator said that, at one point in the treasury of King Solomon, he had 25 tons of gold. 25 tons of gold. I mean, the guy is fabulously, unbelievably wealthy and rich. And again, what does wealth do to us? Because wealth creates, let's be honest, when we're wealthy, it creates a feeling of self-confidence and self-sufficiency. I'm good. I've got it all together. As we think about all this, of course, how do we know that he started to go off because of his pride? You know what? Here's the big lesson. We read this, that King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. And they were from nations, now listen carefully, and they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts will surely turn your hearts after their gods. And nevertheless we read, and Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. And as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. Now listen, it goes on to say, actually you read this in the story, in the last page of this chapter, he followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. These were the gods in which children would be sacrificed. Now this is Solomon, who had just before had prayed before in the temple as it was being dedicated that God, as your servants continue wholeheartedly following you, you will bless them. And in fact, God had came to Solomon a second time and had reminded him basically this: if you do just what I say and make me Lord over everything in your life, I'll come down and I'll fill your life and I'll give you everything and your kingdom will reign forever. Listen, just follow me, obey me, trust my way. And I think, you know what? I believe Solomon said, I'm smart. And I know that it says not to intermarry with these other women, but listen, I'm king. I've got to make some political decisions here. There's a good rationale for this. Besides, I'm smart. I can handle it. I can handle it. I'm good. It's not too big for me. Rather than just listening to God's way and saying, don't intermarry. Don't let these women turn your heart after their gods. Don't break one of the big 10. You shall have no other gods before me. No, God, I'm smart. I can handle it. I'm good. I know what to do. What is it about pride? I mean, this is where I want just to end the message today. Where is it? I mean, when I talk to young people about who are they going to marry in their life, this is a warning. Marry someone who's in the same trajectory as you. I mean, if I'm going to talk, though, to others of us, we just have to say, are we really willing to be obedient to God's way? Or do we say to God, God, I'm smart. I've got this. I know how to handle this. Your ways don't apply to me in this situation. You got to understand the rationale. You know, I think about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13:4. Here's a phrase. Love, it is not proud. Love, it is not proud. You know, I think of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. He says, you know, knowledge makes us feel good, but it's love that builds up God's church. You know, knowledge puffs up, love builds up. So there's the challenge. Will we truly depend on God's way? If we're going to finish well, it means humbly walking with God in the middle section of our lives where we choose well to trust Him. So here's the question. Will we plummet or will we persevere? Will we seek to walk humbly before God, allowing Him to be in every part of our life, and are we willing to trust and are willing to obey? Let's pray. Lord, pride comes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Lord, help us to stop thinking that somehow we can manage it on our own, in our terms, and somehow we're smart enough and self-sufficient enough. Lord, help us to humbly trust your way. Even at times when we say, but this is going to cost me, or this is inconvenient, or Lord, it doesn't seem to make sense. Lord, help us to trust you. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.